In this video I'm going to knit Videung Blouse. The video is meant as a tutorial or a visual guide as a complement to the pattern. If you want to knit the blouse, you can find details about the pattern in the description box below. We are going to start by knitting the sleeves. I have already knit the first sleeve and I'm going to knit the second one in this video. Start by casting on the amount of stitches specified for your size in the pattern. This part is going to be the folded cuff of the sleeve, so the sleeve is knit bottom up. Place a stitch marker at the beginning of round and then knit a few rows according to the pattern. These rows are going to be the folded part at the inside of the cuff. Next, we're going to purl one row to get a clean line when folding the cuff. Then continue knitting according to the pattern. When you get to the bobbles, note that the bobbles in this pattern are smaller than regular bobbles. Start by knitting 3 stitches in one stitch. Turn your work around and purl the 3 stitches for the bobble. Turn your work around again, then slip the first stitch, knit the remaining 2 stitches together, then pass the slipped stitch over the stitches that were knit together. You are going to repeat these steps for every bobble in the pattern. When you have knit the cuff, the next step is to knit the next row together with the cast on stitches. Find the first stitch of the cast on row and bring it up to your needle. Then knit the first stitch of the row together with the first stitch of the cast on row. Repeat until you have knit all stitches of the 2 rows together with each other. We are now going to increase for a gathered effect during this row. Every increase is made by a method called make one forwards loop. When increasing, make a loop in the direction shown in the video. Then knit a stitch and then repeat. You're going to do this for the whole row. Continue knitting according to the pattern until you have knit the correct amount of rows. You can of course adjust the sleeve length to your liking, just make sure to stop at the same point in the chart as in the pattern. Next, we're going to bind up stitches for underneath the arm. The rest of the sleeve is then knit back and forth. I have now followed the chart for the shoulder shaping, and I'm going to continue to follow the chart for the shoulder. We are now going to make the gathers for the puff sleeve. When making the gathers, we are going to be slipping stitches. We are not going to knit anything, so we're going to leave the yarn at the start of the row. You're first going to pick up stitches from the left needle to the right needle according to your size. Next, you're going to slip all of the stitches over the stitch that is closest to the tip of the needle and off the needle. You're going to do this one by one until you only have the stitch closest to the needle remaining. You're going to repeat the steps according to the pattern and your size. When you have made all of your gathers, the next step is to bind off the remaining stitches. You are going to bind off in a standard bind off. To avoid holes, we're going to sew the gathers and the bind off edge together. Make a stitch into one of the gathers, then make a stitch into the corresponding bind off stitch. We are going to repeat this for every gather. This is the back of the blouse. The front and the back is very similar, except for the deeper neckline of the front. I have already knit the back, so in this video I'm going to knit the front. The front and back of the blouse is knit from the top down, so I'm going to start at the shoulders and the neckline. Here I am casting on stitches for the front of the neck. I am using regular knitting needles, but you can of course use circular ones if you prefer. The stitches for the middle of the neckline are cast on separately. I have already knit the right upper front, so I'm going to continue knitting the left upper front before I assemble the pieces for the front. I now have all 3 pieces for the front. I am going to start by placing them all in the correct direction on the same needle. Make sure none of the stitches are twisted and that all of the pieces are in the correct position before continuing. Then continue following the instructions for the front of the blouse. I have now knit the front armhole shaping and the front of the body. The next step is to bind off the stitches before I continue with the peplum. The reason that you bind off and pick up your stitches for the peplum is that you want the gathers to be visible, and to do that you need to avoid the stretch of the fabric. This method creates a clear line without stretch between the upper part and the peplum. Bind off your stitches by purling them and at the same time binding off in a standard bind off. Next we're going to cut the yarn, and then we're going to pick up all of the stitches once again. Pick up your stitches through the loops of the purl stitch that is pointing towards you. Make sure that you pick up every single stitch in the correct loop to get a clean placement of the pattern. Next, we're going to increase for a gathered look during the next purl row. We're going to increase using the same method as before with the make one forwards loop. Continue by following the pattern for the peplum. Next, we're going to purl one row for the folded edge. Here I have knit the rest of the rows for the folded edge. I am then going to bind off using a standard bind off. Measure out about 3 lengths of the edge of the bind off, then cut the yarn, and then we're going to sew down the edge. If you're unsure where to sew, the best method is to count the bumps of the purls before and after the fold line to make sure that you have the same amount. You can do this whenever you get lost as well. You're then going to sew along the same line of purl bumps to get a clean line. When you have finished both the back and the front, the next step is to sew the shoulder seams together. Line up your pieces with the right sides facing each other. Start at one of the shoulders and seam the 2 sides together. For each stitch, I like to go up in the middle of the last stitch for a stronger seam. Then I'm going to repeat for the other shoulder. Then I'm going to continue by sewing the side seams. When sewing, try lining up the pattern of the bobbles if possible. When done, you're then going to repeat for the other side seam. Next, we're going to sew the sleeves into place. I have already sewn my first sleeve into place, and now I'm going to sew the second sleeve into place. Start by placing the sleeve in the correct way. The right side of the blouse should meet the right side of the sleeve. We are then going to line up the middle of the cast off stitches underneath the arm with the seam. You can pin the sleeve into place before you start sewing if you want to. We are then going to start sewing. I'm using the same method as before, where for each stitch I go up in the middle of the last stitch. When sewing the sleeve in, it's important to line up the middle of the gathers with the top seam. If you are a beginner at sewing, I would recommend to place a lot of pins before you start sewing in the sleeves. When you get to the gathered part, try to sew into the gathers to avoid holes. When you have sewn in both sleeves, the remaining step is to knit the neckline. Start at the middle of the back. I like to count the bobbles to make sure I'm at the middle. Start by casting on 3 stitches with a long tail cast on double pointed needles. You're then going to use the same needle and pick up 1 stitch at the middle of the back. Slide your 4 stitches to the right point of the needle. You're then going to knit 2 stitches and then knit the remaining 2 stitches together through the back loops. Pick up the next stitch along the neckline, then continue with the I-cord following the same steps as before. When you have knit an I-cord around the whole neckline, bind off your stitches, then try grafting the 2 ends of the I-cord together as closely as possible. Next, I'm going to weave in the ends. I like to secure the ends together and then I like to hide them in the I-cord if possible. The rest of the ends I like to weave in into the seams if possible. I try to avoid weaving in the ends in the fabric. Your blouse should now be ready to block. It is important to block your garment since the stitches then have the opportunity to relax and look neater.